This is the Ronin Philosopher, where I take a look at martial arts and try to examine all aspects of it from a philosophical point of view. I have always been a huge fan of the martial arts, starting taking it when I was living back in Rochester up in upstate New York, and my parents taking me to Taekwondo classes and then later karate. I fell out of it for a few years after that, but got back into it in college, and the passion has remained with me ever since. My reasons for taking it was basically trying to have an outlet for all the energy that I had, rather than trying to learn discipline or control, though some of that did come with it, but took longer to take for me. Of course, these reasons are all fine and good, but that's also where people tend to quickly lose interest. Something as trendy as a new Christmas toy you get one year and then forget about it the next. However, it became something more to me. It became a passion, and that way I used it to connect with myself in ways that I had not been able to before, in both good and bad ways. Now, concerning martial arts as an objective definition, at its core, it's essentially the native style of a particular fighting group or culture. Traditionally, this has meant Asia, but I think it's safe to assume that it can apply to any culture across the world now. Since the 1990s, martial arts have been divided into two camps: traditional martial artists, or TMA, and mixed martial arts, or MMA. And the two stereotypically do not get along. Rivalries between schools and disciplines is nothing new, but their backstories I find are quite interesting. For TMA, it would logically apply your styles to a rooted historical form or practice that has a lineage behind it. Karate, Kung Fu, Muay Thai, and Sammo would all fall into this category, as well as some European martial arts as well, such as Fiore sword fighting and German sword fighting as well. Meanwhile, MMA's application depends on your history in Western culture. Most commonly, it's assumed to come from the 1960s and 70s, when action star and martial artist Bruce Lee founded and developed his mixed martial arts form of Jeet Kune Do, a style that was said to be formless, and took in all aspects with the famous quote, "Take in what's useful and discard what is not necessary." However, there are many TMA martial artists who argue that the concept of MMA has been around long before Bruce Lee even came along, citing that the Indonesian style of Silat is a definition. Speaking of definition, MMA doesn't stick to one form or style or kata, but instead draws the best form from various styles to be molded into one's personal variant. This can range from borrowed techniques such as punching and kicking from karate, taekwondo, and even kung fu, to a simple ground and pound style like pankration or wrestling. That being said though, the prime difference is how each camp views fighting in general. In the West, like much of other components of life, it is often seen as simply a tool to accomplish an end. It's less about honor and more practical minded. Last man standing wins and their style is better. And because of this view, many MMA fighters consider TMA to be obsolete. This argument has made great strides since the UFC made its appearance in the 1990s. Many fighters of all styles jumped at the chance of actual live combat with almost no rules. And the results were that many of the traditional practitioners fell victim to other styles that were more modern and exploited their inherent weaknesses, or were just simple ground and pound fighting. And though modern UFC is a far cry from its early counterpart and is much more diverse than it used to be, still many fighters have adapted to saying, "Your kung fu is no good here." The more moderate camp will acknowledge the value and effectiveness of TMA styles, but will still criticize their failure to adapt to newer techniques and training regimens. Indeed, some have questioned the lack of Asian fighters in UFC, crediting it to several factors that include cultural loyalty to old systems, or simply too afraid to fight larger and taller Western fighters that were more about victory than technique. Even though it's becoming less and less the case, where I've seen more of Asian martial artists start to go into UFC fighting. In Eastern cultures too, martial arts are about practicality as well. Despite many of the hemisphere styles working from a root system, they can be just as brutal as their Western counterparts when allowed to be. However, it is also viewed as more than just a simple hammer or a tool. When I took Aikido, one of my teachers from Japan briefly spoke about MMA and called it the human equivalent of chicken fighting. Many TMA practitioners would agree with him and believe MMA lacks the substance and soul and focuses exclusively on the violence of martial arts instead. One of the heads of one championship broadcast and a Muay Thai practitioner himself, phrases it best when he says, "The reality in Asia is that it," meaning martial arts, "is a lifestyle and a platform to unleash your potential as a human being." In the West, this idea is not really considered practical, and at best it might apply to their physical conditioning. But in many Eastern mindsets, fighting had to be something more than just fighting. It had to carry over into other areas of someone's life. And if you were the toughest and baddest motherfucker in the ring, but could not use any of that style outside of it, or after you retire, then essentially your fighting style was useless. Another side to this argument, though, is that the fear that is said to plague some TMA practitioners, that adapting to changing times and new opposing styles dilutes the significance of their own style that they've studied for decades. If fighting is also considered an expression of your cultural identity, then changing because everyone else is changing might cause your identity to eventually disappear. Then it would become meaningless or a copycat of someone else's culture, something that many non-Western cultures are very much afraid of and want nothing to do with. Either way, both camps have many assumptions about the other, the primary ones being that MMA considers TMA akin to dancing practice, while the other views its rival as perhaps effective, but soulless and with a focus strictly on one aspect of fighting. However, what I found is that it is often the assumptions that get people on both camps into the most trouble. There are many TMA styles that are extremely brutal and could border even on being inhuman, and, though rooted in a systematic form, were used commonly in warfare where there really are no rules. Likewise, there are many MMA fighters who have taken the personal lessons of TMA and applied it to their lives as well, while still being MMA fighters. Likewise, many soldiers who have learned more modern fighting techniques like Krav Maga and Systema have applied the mental focus and spirit of TMA into their lives and into their fighting, even if they don't practice it as much. These oversights are easy to understand. Large egos and pride often come in tandem with learning how to fight. They are probably the biggest obstacles that fighters from both sides have to overcome as the global community continues to interact with them and learn from each other. An example of that is in One Direction Championship, which features many bouts with diverse sets of fighters, as well as using modern techniques as well. Even Western fighters are choosing to fight in this arena, so there's the possibility in the future that perhaps there will be more mutual appreciation of what the other side has to offer. The violence is something both sides can agree upon as part of their perceptions, and that can be the basis of forming a mutual respect. But at the same time, when it comes to the world of martial arts and combat, respect is earned in combat, not through just discussion. And I find the key to this is respecting that both groups have different priorities about what is considered important. And if both sides can agree to the values of those priorities to each other while still holding on to their own priorities and maybe have some sparring matches as well, or at least discussing them, then perhaps there can be less animosity between the two and perhaps even more fusion as well. But as long as both sides feel they have something to prove, whether they consider it manliness, toughness, power, independence, or the like, then it will be a hard road to come to that understanding.